Oh, hello, welcome. Apparently, when I did my presentation on TAMK, the audio didn't record well or didn't record at all. And so I've had a few people ask me if I'd mind recording it again. So that's what I'm doing. So I guess I'm lucky in a way because that also allows me maybe a little bit of more flexibility on time and to say a few things that maybe I wouldn't have got the chance to say during the live talk. But of course, we lose the spontaneity, the reactions of people in the room, me reacting to those people, if you like, the improvisation of it all, the live dynamics, but never mind. So I'm here today to talk about resonating with a liquid curriculum. And making a case for a fluid education. So fluid education, in a way, is a term that I'm using, a framework I'm using in a way, to try and convey some of my own beliefs and ideas that I have about what education should be, that I've gathered from 3.5 decades as an educator, more if you count my time studying my bachelor's of education in the 80s. So in all that time, I've kind of been lucky enough to work in different contexts, in different countries around the world at different levels, from schools to colleges to universities of applied sciences. And I've been lucky enough to work with a wealth of very clever, very knowledgeable people, also from around the world, a whole host of international experts. Some of them have been students, some of them have been colleagues, people I've met as well at conferences, and I've befriended and so on. So I'm drawing on all that with this thing that I'm calling fluid education. And part of that as well, linked to that, is something that I'm calling the liquid curriculum. But there's also other aspects such as a pedagogy of resonance, hence resonating with a liquid curriculum. So that's first of all to explain kind of what I'm talking about. It was also a very, very difficult presentation to prepare for because normally in my presentations, I try to kind of have a narrative arc, a very clear beginning, middle, and end, and tell a story. And I find that really difficult in this case. I'm not really sure where to begin. Does it all begin when I decided to leave investment banking and become a teacher? Does it begin when I was doing my B.Ed? Does it begin with a particular insight, a book I read? So I feel kind of stuck in the middle, and there's lots of directions I could go in. Um, and the reason for this slide that you have there, you've just entered the rhizome, is actually that's what rhizomatic learning is like. You're always kind of in the center. You can go out in any direction, that there isn't a kind of beginning, middle, and end. A rhizome is a concept from botany, actually. So I'm immediately making the mistake of mixing metaphors. Um, and actually, this lovely slide was, an image was created actually by one of my MBA educational leadership students, Brody Robbins. So I must give him his attribution for this, who was also kind of looking at aspects of rhizomatic learning. Might come back to him later if I've got time. I wanted to understand as well, though, these ideas of a fluid education and of a liquid curriculum are very much a work in progress. And my idea was this, that within the structure of TAMK Day, there are really three things. There's the video, the stimulating video we're meant to prepare, the presentation itself, which is this, and the paper. And my idea was that I didn't want to just duplicate the thing 3 times. So the people who took the time to watch the video before the talk would get something different from what's in this talk, and then would get something different from what's in the paper. And my idea was the video was kind of a prequel. It gives a little bit of the backstory of why I even ended up using this framework. So if you've got 7.5 minutes or so to spare, you could go to YouTube. It's linked in the conference resources, and you can watch that video. Then there's this presentation. And then I'm hoping, of course, eventually the papers will be presented. And my paper is more kind of theoretical in a way, a bit more abstract, perhaps. It looks at some of the literature that supports what I'm saying, though I will mention that here, but maybe won't go into quite the same depth or make quite the same case. But if you want to know the background, go and see the video on YouTube that you were meant to watch before the talk. Of course, here as well, in all of these words I'm using, I am dealing with metaphor. I think metaphor is really important in education. Sometimes it's really quite hard to get at the thing we're teaching. And so we use metaphor to connect with our students with things that they already know and understand. And I like liquid, particularly with regard to education, because of course, well, liquid can be in different states. It can be frozen solid as it is outside my window at the moment with the cold weather. So it can be static and frozen and locked in, not flowing at all. It can also be very vaporous and cloud-like and hard to kind of connect with. And it can also be this flowing liquid thing that is, it contains waves and currents. There might be whirlpools and eddies and ripples and rapids, or very calm. We can try to channel it, but we never really have control. It can flood, it can get beyond our control. It's a complex system. You can have floods, you can have droughts. One that's perhaps particularly applicable sometimes is there can be things going on below the surface that are not visible. You can stay shallow. You can have a shallow learning experience, learning the main things you need to learn to pass an exam or whatever, or you can dive deep, immerse yourself fully. Always the danger, though, of maybe drowning if you do that. So I think it is a useful metaphor for many of the things we do in education, recognizing that all metaphors are not perfect by definition. If they were perfect, they wouldn't be metaphors, they'd be the thing itself. So recognizing the weaknesses of metaphors, realizing that they're complex things and they aren't the thing itself, I still think it's useful. Through this talk, this is what I go more into in the paper. I'm drawing, though, on ideas that come from Zygmunt Bauman. Late Zygmunt Bauman, was a sociologist and philosopher. Hartmut Rosa, a current and living philosopher and also sociologist, and the educational philosopher, Biesta, who's probably the most influential figure that I can think of with regard to the way that I see, understand, and act in education. My beliefs, my underpinning kind of beliefs, why I'm an educator and what the purpose of education is. So I'm going to be drawing on their ideas quite a lot to try and get this concept across. That means a wealth of literature over the years. So Bauman, I think, wrote about 9 or 10 books on liquid modernity. The original was just called Liquid Modernity. I think one of the last ones he wrote before he died was Liquid Times, Living in an Age of Uncertainty. But also drawing on, as I say, Hartmut Rosa. The Uncontrollability of the World is a very short but very readable book. Resonance and Sociology of Our Relationship to the World. There have been books specifically about higher education in liquid modernity, Oxenham. As I say, Biesta's book in 2009, Good Education in an Age of Measurement, is probably more applicable today than when it was written. And his critique of these focusing on just measurement, subtitled Ethics, Politics and Democracy, and his most recent book, World-Centered Education, A View for the Present, also an important piece of work in my opinion. So these are kind of just a few, and there's a list of references we'll come to at the end, but kind of where I'm drawing from, the theoretical framework. But as you'll see, it's not just theoretical. So what's my premise? Well, my premise is in a way that, let's look at the theories first of all. You have liquid modernity, which, as I say, originates with Bauman. And this is the idea that our present condition and our way of living is, trying to move my image. We're in a state of constant change, living in a globalized society that affects all aspects of human life. It affects our relationships, our identities, our work, our community. And this liquid modernity is manifested by flows and by flux because everything's changing all of the time, which means, of course, there's uncertainty and there's risk. And we also experience as humans feelings of alienation. So in his books on liquid modernity, Bauman sets out this kind of framework for how we experience the modern world, the contemporary world, and all of the changes taking place, whether political, geopolitical, technological, sociological, cultural, and so on. More recent work by Hartmut Rosa, looks at social acceleration, but as I mentioned as well, his work on also resonance and uncontrollability is really influential in my thinking. But his argument here is that social acceleration means that everything in modern society is actually speeding up. Technological change, cultural change, political change, everything in life, faster machines, more changes. This also leads us to feel restless, stuck. We never really get our things to do list ever done and completed. We feel frustrated, perhaps depressed, senses of well-being decline. We never reach our goals. It, again, affects how we think about ourselves and our relationship to the world. So social acceleration is kind of to do with our relationship with time and a place in the world and how it can actually make us feel, again, quite alienated to the world in which we're living. So to me, these are really both quite important concepts. They obviously have an impact on education because education happens in the world. So our students and us are affected by these social changes, by the fact that we're in liquid modernity. And there's a solid body of literature on all of these ideas. You can also tie it in, by the way, to other phrases you've heard, for example, the VUCA world. Yeah, and I mentioned that in the paper. But for this presentation, let's stick to this. My argument is that this presents a problem for education. So if I pull that work together, what you have is living in a time where we want certainty, controllability, predictability, and measurability. So I'm drawing here on the work of the aforementioned authors. We want a world that tends to be instrumental and technocratic, and very much a focus on what can be measured. So that's our kind of desire. And we want education to be just like that, as we would like that actually in all aspects of our life. So sort of, we know what outcomes are going to be. So you take an input, you add certain things to the input, you get an output, and the output is measurable and controllable. But the problem is, in my view, that education is actually much more complex, it's much more emergent, connected, organic, networked. There are no certain results. In fact, as Biesta writes in a book entitled The Beautiful Risk of Education, you never really know what your students are going to learn. You can have intended learning outcomes, you can have the goals of your curriculum, you can have your exams. Your students may or may not learn those things, and they almost certainly will learn some other things you did not intend along the way. Maybe about themselves, maybe about other people they work with, maybe about you as a teacher, or about the world in general. But there's a hidden curriculum, a null curriculum, a whole host of things going on that are really complex and are uncertain. So there's an inherent risk. You only need to teach 2 courses to 2 different groups to know that you do not get the same results with every student every time. But we want everything to be controllable. So there's this kind of friction that's going on. There's all kinds of problems with this. I mean, 2 that I mentioned recently, and they were talked about in a presentation I arranged for the MEL students on generative AI and these kind of focus on what can be measured is the McNamara fallacy and Goodhart's law, two immediate things. Goodhart's law is the idea that any measure, as soon as you make it a goal, ceases to be a good measure. Of course, we know that's true because you simply start to game the system to achieve the goal. You lose sight of what it is that it's really measuring and just change your actions to achieve the goal, however that may be achieved, whether it's real or not. And by the way, we see that a lot with the use of things like learning analytics, because we forget that they're just proxies, they're signals. Okay, if you look at the study of economics, and particularly signals in economics, these are signals, but they're not the learning itself. Clicking on the link to say a student has looked at something isn't the learning itself. The number of views of a lecture video is not the learning itself. Sometimes they're quite good signals, other times they're less reliable. We never really know, it's uncertain. So that's Goodhart's law. McNamara's fallacy relates to Robert McNamara. He was Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. And basically his notion was that if something can't be measured, it didn't really exist. And that led to obviously all kinds of problems. For example, body counts in the Vietnam War could be measured, and therefore, if America had a lower body count than the Vietnamese, then they were winning the war, which of course they didn't. So these are problems with focusing only on measures. And to be clear, I'm not saying that measures aren't important. I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. Okay, to be clear, but is this the only thing that we should be looking at? And can we not accept that there is a beautiful risk, that there are things that we can't control, and that the art and craft of education actually comes from the unpredictability and uncertainty of it? Now, the reason we have this going on globally is because of political aspects. You say they're tied to what happens when you put the logic of the market into education. And without wanting to go on to a polemic about the problems of applying market forces to education, I'll just leave it to a professor from Tampere University, UC, who spoke to our male students last August, and he was looking at the funding model that's used particularly for universities of applied sciences, the performance-based funding, which, oh, there's a typo there, that should be PBF, not PDF, which is, of course, a file format. But PBF is overemphasized. So everything is tied to performance, and that leads to a problem. Okay, so this is not from me, this is from people whose actual whole research career is based on looking at governance and educational policy and how the impacts that that has on culture and society. So there is a systemic problem. Just to make it clear, this is not about kind of critique of our particular leadership or of Finnish universities of applied sciences. This is happening around the world, but it's a problem. Okay, I'm now making another jump. Another thing I've learned in my time in education is that there's no unifying theory of education. Now, again, obviously, I'm stealing or appropriating a phrase from physics here, the unifying theory of everything. But what I mean by that in the context of education is that there is no single curriculum that's a best curriculum. There is no single pedagogy that's a right pedagogy. There is no method or technique that is the correct technique. There is not the technology. There is not a single answer that solves the problem of education. In fact, I have a problem with the idea of framing it as a problem to be solved. Okay, so there are multiple curriculums, multiple pedagogies. So there may be times, for example, when a lecture is absolutely the right thing to give. There may be times when having learning competencies specified competencies are the right thing, but not every time. Depends on the context, depends on the content, it depends upon the whole history, environment, culture, economics, a whole really complex mishmash assemblage of ideas, okay, that are changing, dynamic, and emergent. But the problem is, because we want fixed result, we want controllability, there's this tendency to say, this method or this curriculum is working really well here, so we'll apply it everywhere. Okay, and then be surprised when you don't get the same results. So there is, in my view, absolutely no single unifying theory of education. A kind of amusing example of that, going back to 2009, so what's that, 15 years ago, but The Onion, that wonderful satirical magazine, kind of made a joke out the idea that there might be, when they had an article called The Montessori School of Dentistry, which lets students discover their own root canal procedures. And I really like this because I am in favour of project-based, experiential learning, being driven by students' own curiosity. That's good, but this makes the lovely point that that isn't the best thing every time. So as it says in the articles, teachers are roving dental facilitators, and I love that little dig, as they prefer to be called, can be difficult to spot. They often choose to stay out of the way of their inquisitive pupils and only make gentle suggestions as to how an infected root chamber should be drained. Well, obviously not really a good thing. When performing a root canal, there's no such thing as right or wrong, said Montessori educator Vanessa Perrin, who added that she doesn't so much teach her students how to treat an inflamed nerve, but lead them to an open mouth and then stand back. Sure, we could say to our students, the enamel here has been completely eroded, and this needs to be addressed immediately. But what could be more satisfying, what is more dynamic, than to just let them slowly develop an impression of why a patient might be screaming? Of course, it's not serious, but it does make the point that the way you might teach somebody dentistry or how to operate in the control room of a nuclear power station is different from how you may teach some technique in the humanities or the social sciences, for example. So that's really an illustration to prove my point about a single unifying theory. Yet we do that. Yet we do have examples. And again, this is not a TAMK dig, but a leader, an educational leader, sees something works in one domain and then says, we must apply it everywhere. That is also not to say that I don't believe in the notion of sharing best practice. Of course, that's important. There are things we can learn. We can learn from other disciplines. We can learn from all aspects of education and the world beyond education, formal education and informal education. Sure, we should be open to those, but it's when things are mandated, when things, you will do it this way, that we start to get problems. I also think we have a problem with atomization in education. In the attempt to make things more controllable, in the attempt to get certain results, the idea is, of course, that we end up with a McDonaldization of education, that the predictable Big Mac comes out the end, and we all know what that Big Mac is going to be like. It's the same everywhere, no matter which school or university it comes out. We know this is how you prepare it. But the problem with that is that where do you get the nutritious gourmet meal? Where is that happening? So again, I'm all for rigor. I'm all for quality. Absolutely, yes. But one of the dangers of kind of these systems is that we end up with very uniform standardization where everything's the same. And then where do you get your high achievers, your geniuses, the people who really push things forward? Now, as I say, I see things have been broken down into smaller and smaller aspects, which I actually see as reductive. So during my career, I've seen us go from learning objectives, that is to say what a teacher wants, to learning outcomes, which is what, of course, the students should achieve, to now competencies, and now the introduction of things like micro-credentials and badges. In certain contexts, with certain content, that's great, but not all the time, because we lose something in that reduction. As we drill down for controllability, we lose, or we're certainly in big danger of losing, the big picture, the holistic, and focusing in on smaller and smaller parts. When I came to Finland, I used to go and work with Krita Proki, presenting Finnish education in many different countries around the world. And one of the things, one of the images we would often use on slides is this one, which I actually don't have an original source where it came from. But the argument both of us will be making is kind of life is messy and it's complex, and you mix colors up and so on. And yet in school we have geography and geometry and art and biology. And kind of we need to somehow make school more like life and more of a preparation for life. Ironically, though, what we've now started to do is break each of these down, art, biology, and so on, economics, my own subject area, finance and banking, even more so before I came into education, to break them down into competencies, competence, a badge, a micro-credential. So instead of actually understanding the body of literature and the history that informs biology, the history of biology, its literature, its canon, we end up with distinct little tiny competence bites that lose sight of that big picture. Of course, I know the argument's, oh, it doesn't have to be that way. We can design a curriculum so that doesn't happen. But that is the danger, that we end up with a kind of competency supermarket and a student without any real guidance and without any real knowledge of what they do not know. That's the problem with student-centered learning, that a student doesn't know what they don't know. So they go around picking up their competencies and their badges and going to the checkout. But sometimes an expert is needed. Sometimes you do need to be told what you don't know in order that you need to find out about it. So that worries me and it concerns me. That's not to say competencies are always bad. It's not to say I'm against badges or against micro-credentials. But again, it's like, oh, every subject should now have them, every domain. And that's problematic for me. So what I'm looking for in a liquid curriculum is something that flows more, that sometimes is solid and sometimes is vaporous, and sometimes we channel it. Sometimes there are eddies and storms, and sometimes you go deep and sometimes you stay shallow, kind of mixing things up in that way. Linking to this idea of subjects and competencies, I just want to say nothing I'm saying is new. We could trace a lot of this stuff back to people like Dewey, 100-odd years or so ago. Project-based learning can be traced back over 100 years. I could show you the papers for that. Here I just wanted to introduce a concept to you because I think it's very interesting. It comes from David Nelson. He was a real pioneer in the field of computers. And he wrote a book in 1974 called Computer Lived, Dream Machines, self-published. It's a really interesting book. It's double-ended. One end is Dream Machines, which kind of looks at all the potential of computers and what they might achieve in the future. And Computer Lib is kind of a more technical book about using computers, and they work towards the middle. And the screenshot is from that book where he talks about intertwingularity, the fact that things are deeply intertwingled. And that was the first use of that word, but you can Google it and you can look up how it's been used in literature. But in a way, as it's summed up there, best in the quote from the book, in an important sense, there are no subjects at all. There is only all knowledge. And since the cross connections among the mirrored topics of this world simply cannot be divided up neatly. So what you have here is almost an early statement of some of the ideas that turned into connectivism. George Siemens and Stephen Downes' ideas of connected knowledge. You've also got things that turned into network learning and network knowledge as well. And Nelson, as I say, was a real pioneer. You wouldn't have hyperlinks. You wouldn't have the hyperlink idea or the back button on your browser without David Nelson, something as simple as a back browser. By the way, his vision of a hyperlink, hypertext, was a bit different to what we ended up with. Again, it got reduced. Again, talk about being reductive. It got reduced. So what he wanted with a hyperlink is a visible bridge from one thing to another. Whereas what we have at the moment is you can be in one page of The Guardian and you click a link and then you're somewhere else on the internet. Suddenly you're in YouTube, or suddenly you're, I don't know, on the BBC website or whatever. You just jump around with no sense of history. And Nelson's idea for all hypertext was that there was a visible bridge, which also allows, if you think about it, things like attribution and so on to be much clearer, links between things. So all the links connecting ideas become much more visible in this intertwinkled universe, the kind of epistemic universe of knowledge and understanding. It's an interesting idea, and it's kind of a pity we ended up with a much reduced version in a way, but it's simpler and cheaper to implement what we've got. Anyway, this is my brain at the moment, or an attempt to draw it, but actually not really. Yeah, there's so much missing from this. But when I was making the slide, I was trying to show within my liquid curriculum and within fluid education, the various things I'm thinking about. So, for example, there's rhizomatic learning, which I've mentioned, which is very much connected to the idea of networked heutagogy, but also to entangled pedagogy and network knowledge. They're all linking to intertwinkularity in the middle there. You've got Biesta's world-centered education with liquid modernity and social acceleration. Rosa's resonance, which I think can be a really sound basis for kind of pedagogical ideas, very much linked with self-determination theory, which is really what I believe motivates people. If you want to motivate students and motivate colleagues, that is really an area I think you should be looking at. Notions from, who was it now? Stewart and Cohen, I think, on extelligence, which is the things that support our cognitive understanding but are not human, they're outside of us. So, for example, this pen and this notebook are part of my intelligence. And I actually, maybe AI should actually be AE, artificial extelligence, rather than artificial intelligence. So that's an idea, a concept, perhaps. Rhizomatic, I've mentioned, that comes from Dave Cormier. It's connected, as I've mentioned already, to George Siemens and Stephen Downes. Connectivism, network heutagogy obviously comes from Knowles. Those who know pedagogy, andragogy, and heutagogy ideas. So lots of connection, lots of ideas, and I'm just thinking about this stuff and how it impacts what we do in education. Okay, to get back to practicalities now, rather than kind of abstract theory that's blowing my brain out. In the MEL program, the MBA in Educational Leadership, we were fortunate enough to have support from our leadership, particularly SAID, in terms of running what we've called a COOC, which is a bit like a MOOC, but it's not massive. So instead of massive open online course, we have collaborative open online course. And this is open, it's free of charge, it's on the DigiCampus platform, and it's a way for people to see what we do on the MBA in Educational Leadership, to do a few weeks, 6 weeks, looking at some of the topics we cover and learning in the way that we do on the program. So it's kind of a taster. And then we encourage them to sign up and apply for our course. knowing how we work, knowing the pedagogies or heutagogies that we use, knowing the kind of subject area. It's good for us too, because we also get to know something about our applicants before they apply. But the point here, to go back to kind of my non-unified model of education, instead of building it around the notion of competencies, intended learning outcomes, and so on, we're able to build those first 6 weeks. There is another couple that I won't talk about here, but those 6 weeks around themes: the purpose of education, you as a leader, education in the future, understanding the system, and so on. Okay? And within those, what we do is pose questions rather than competencies. Because when we address what is the purpose of education, that's a discussion. That's to encourage reflection, is to encourage critical thinking, and to frame it as a competence, I think, is kind of reductive and incorrect. So what is the purpose of education? There are multiple answers. They're contextual, cultural, maybe even religious in some cases. There's a lot going on there. So we look at those. Purpose. Why is it even an important question to think about? And what is your role in achieving that purpose? How are you involved in that? Who are you as a leader? Who are you? What are your values? What motivates you and what motivates others? And how do you lead yourself? So you can see these are all questions for which there isn't a single answer. What's important is the thinking, discussion, reflection that goes on, hearing and being open to other people's opinions and views, formulating your own, questioning your own assumptions, questioning the assumptions of others, looking at ideas you've perhaps never met before that haven't arisen in your life that may be very relevant. So we take that approach rather than competencies. And in the MEL program itself, this is actually something I made back, I think it was in either late 2016 or early 2017, when we were then trying to convince the leadership of TAMK to run the program. I remember there was Päivi Kartinen. There was also another vice principal, but it wasn't Mikko, but another vice principal who went on to Tampere University. We were trying to show that the idea of this program wasn't the teacher, who also happens to be bald-headed with a beard, telling the students the answer to those questions. Instead, it's a network. And in fact, of course, the network goes beyond the people. It actually isn't stopped with the students. They, in turn, have a distributed network. So it's collaborative, it's distributed, it's participatory, and we have a network heutagogy. But as you can see, they didn't like the spelling and it got underlined in Prezi, from which I was using for this presentation when I made this back in 2017. So that's kind of ideas that kind of, I think, how you can make a curriculum fluid, how you can make things connected and flow, how you can have a fluid education. So just to end, I want to make it clear that my position now is I view education as an existential journey that challenges us to explore and create ourselves in the world. And it's taken me a long time to get to this. This isn't where I started as an educator in 1989. It's been a long journey. I'm using the word existential, by the way, not in the same way as a newspaper might use it when it talks about the existential threat of climate change or nuclear weapons. I'm using it in the philosophical sense, drawing on Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, other existential philosophers. That is to say, our existence, our authenticity, our freedom and agency and responsibility in the world. So it's about our responsibility and our agency within the world, and it challenges us to explore and create ourselves in the world. And that is really what education should be about, in my opinion. So this is me. You can contact me if you have any questions, if you want the paper, if you're interested in talking about these ideas. This is what generative AI thinks that I looked at, DALL-E thinks I look like. Of course, I don't actually have melded arms as I do in that image. And I also have no idea at all who the lady is on my computer screen in the corner of that image. Honestly, no idea. I haven't written a book, but maybe I will, but it won't be called The Liquid. Well, maybe it will. Maybe I'll write Liquid Curric. This is a hallucination by generative AI, where I link liquid curriculum with rhizomatic learning in a book that's not really written at all. And finally, thank you for your time. Thank you for watching this. If you want to talk to me, please do. And in the remaining slides, there are all the various literature, not just from this presentation, but also that applies to the paper that was written as well. So there. Thank you very much. And there I shall end. Bye-bye.